So this, again, this is just sort of the foundation of the colonies. We'll get into, like, next week, we'll start covering more the economics, the culture, like how the colonies actually function, which is I'll be honest, that's a little bit of what I enjoy, right? I enjoy a little bit more of the sort of social aspects of history, right? Like how people functioned and thought. That's just, I'm personally just fascinated by people. I think people are fascinating. All right, so I think this is where we got to on Wednesday. Yes. Okay. I do want to go back real quick because I don't know. I made the comment to you that Hopkins was a business owner. Yes. Yeah. Right. But I don't think I did a good enough job of do we know what a tavern is? Mm-hmm. What is it? It's a bar. Does that strike anybody as odd?
No. Are they Puritans?
Okay, yes, that should. These are devoutly religious people. It actually probably should. It struck me as a little odd. I don't know a ton, or did not know a ton about Puritan faith, right? But they were a religious culture that was totally okay with drinking, right? Some subsets of Christianity don't drink at all, and some don't see a problem with it in the slightest. The Puritans, again, I mean, they're like so devout, but yeah, they were drinkers, right? And when we really get into like the culture of New England, you're going to learn lots of fun things about them because they, obviously they were building bars in the 1700s, right? They also built universities in the 1700s, which you'll find in like 2 years go hand in hand.
The bar and
the college.
The college.
How
did they go hand in hand?
Every college town in America has like at least a dozen bars.
So that's how they go hand in hand?
Yeah, that's how they go hand in hand. Okay, so we've gone through Virginia and Massachusetts, and again, I told you these are going to be the two big ones that we'll cover, right? We'll go over these over and over and over again, and we'll sort of juxtapose. We'll compare the two of them to one another because they're going to start very differently. And then I'm going to be honest with you, like when we sit there and talk about like, oh, here's what happened in Massachusetts, you can kind of be like, and it also happened in Rhode Island and Connecticut and like the other New England territories, right? The other New England colonies. There's a fair amount of similarity. So Rhode Island is chartered in 1644. It's chartered as a royal colony, right? Which is, I believe, the second of the three that you need to know, right? So we already went over joint stock company, yes? Okay, a royal colony is basically a colony in which the individual running it is given authority to do so by the British Crown, right? So like the monarchy has okayed that, therefore they have like the protections of the Crown as British citizens, okay? It's like Rhode Island, and again, if you look at a map, right, like there's my little electoral college map, Rhode Island is underneath Massachusetts and to the right, to the east, which means it's along the coast. This is the first one that gets established with people that are basically kicked out of Massachusetts because they're not religious enough, right? They're not Puritan enough. Okay? And so, again, we talked about this with Massachusetts, right? Like these are people that were sort of run out of England and they went to Holland and then they decide to leave Holland and they come to the New World because they want to be able to practice their religion as they see fit because they were sort of persecuted in Europe. And then we get here to the New World and they're persecuting people that don't fit their understanding of sort of Puritan religion and culture. Okay? So Rhode Island is going to be one of our early colonies then that sort of understands the problems with the Massachusetts Bay Colony and will allow for leadership. So Roger Williams is the first sort of guy in charge of Rhode Island. They have religious freedom or religious tolerance. And then what happens in Rhode Island, we'll use Rhode Island as the example because they're relatively early into some of the economics of it, right? But there's timber and shipbuilding that's going to occur up in the New England area, right? When they arrive, they're using a lot of the woods up in the New England area to build ships for the purposes of commerce, right? And so that's sort of how the New England area originates, right? Connecticut is also founded early on. Okay, no, I guess on my dates I got it backwards. Connecticut came first. Okay, but again, these are basically people removed from Massachusetts, right? They're individuals that do not like some of the aspects of the Puritan church. So in Massachusetts, for instance, if you wanted to vote, you had to be a member of the church, right? Church membership was a requirement for political participation. Okay? So in the Connecticut colony, for instance, all free men can vote, right? All free men are capable of exercising political power and have some level of autonomy. Okay? They do have an official religion, but they're a little bit more tolerant than the Massachusetts colony is. All right. Okay. So now we're gonna jump. I apologize. I was going back over this morning, and I don't have a lot of order to this PowerPoint because we went from like Virginia to Massachusetts. Now we're going back down to Maryland, and then we're gonna go back up. And sorry. Maryland is the third type of thing that you need to understand. Right, or the third type of method of creating a colony that you need to understand. Okay? Maryland is a proprietary colony. Do we know what sole proprietorship means?
No.
Sole ownership. Right? Sole ownership. So basically one dude owns all of Maryland. Okay? Part of the reason that this guy owns Maryland is going to be established as a Catholic sanctuary. Again, this is a colony that is established for religious purposes. Okay? Because in England, okay, so all of you are juniors. All of you took world history, yes? Right? And all of you took world geography, yes?
Yes.
No? Okay. Do we understand like culture and history and religion in Europe? A little bit? Right? We need to understand at least a little bit of the basics of this. Right? Do we know where the Vatican is? First of all, do we know that the Vatican is the head of the Catholic Church? Where is Vatican City? Well, actually within Rome. Like it's literally a country inside the capital of another country. Right? Like that's how small Vatican City is. Right? But that's headed by the Pope. So when you look, right, like Italy is down here, so your southern sort of European nations are Catholic. They follow Catholicism. Right? Your Eastern European nations, right, so like Greece, and then into like Russia, they're Eastern Orthodox, which is like an offshoot of Catholic. I don't want to call it an offshoot of Catholicism. That might be disrespectful to Eastern Orthodox. What? Yeah, like basically the Catholic Church broke at one point, very, very, very early in world history, and so you have like the Catholic Church and their Pope, and then you have Eastern Orthodoxy, and I think they actually have. Do they have somebody they call the Pope? Do y'all know? Yeah, the Eastern Orthodox. But there's not one guy over top of all of the churches like the Pope? Okay, I don't know. But, I mean, interestingly enough, like their sort of practices and traditions do sort of look very similar to Catholicism, right, in terms of how they run their ceremonies and their sort of actual religious practice. Okay? But so here's the thing. Then when you get up to like Northern Europe, right? Northern Europe up here is different. It doesn't have the same Catholic or Orthodox influence, right, as Southern Europe. And so the English are actually anti-Catholic, right? The Irish, at some point in time in world history, a lot of the Irish had converted to Catholicism. And within the English tradition, and then I want you to understand, it will become an American tradition. So we'll continue to talk about this, right? It will become an American tradition. We distrust Catholics. I think that might be the best way of saying it, right? Because there is a underlining belief that Catholics, if forced to choose between the Pope and the President, they will choose the Pope, right? And that's anti-American. You understand that concept? Okay, so because England has the monarchy, right? There's the King of England, okay? And the King of England is divine, and whatever he says goes. If you are devoutly Catholic, and the Pope and the King of England tell you two different things, who do you listen to? I don't know that that's going to be 100% true all the time. Like sometimes it probably comes down to personal preference. Sometimes it probably comes down to like the type of concept that's being discussed, right? Like if it's war, you might side with the king over the Pope, right? If it's salvation, you're probably siding with the Pope, yeah? Okay, so Maryland becomes a refuge for Catholics fleeing Britain. Okay, I'm gonna be honest with you. It's set up this way. It doesn't last long this way, right? So basically, by the middle of the 1600s, right, like the middle of the 17th century, the idea of Catholicism being the dominant religion in Maryland is gone. Okay. But they do have Jesuit priests that come. The Jesuit priests are the same guys that were going for like the Spanish all through Mexico and up into like, well, here, right, Texas now and Arizona, New Mexico, California, right? That's why you have missions everywhere, right? That's sort of what the Jesuit priests were doing. Maryland operates the same way. They have Jesuit missionaries that are going out there looking to convert natives to Christianity, specifically to Catholicism. But when you're going out there with a message of salvation, right, when you're trying to convert, I mean, I guess theoretically there's two ways to do it. You could do convert or die, or you could try to, like, convince them. The best way to convince somebody to join you is to actually, like, be good to them, right? For the most part, in Maryland, they're actually trying to do that, right? So they attempt to have better relations with the Native Americans. They're going to attempt to purchase and negotiate native lands rather than sort of coming and taking them by force, or even in some instances throughout American history, like we negotiated a treaty with the Native Americans, it was completely one-sided. Like the natives don't get anything of value out of what it is that we're dealing with. All right, so now we go back north, and we're going to go to New York, and New York is actually probably the third most important colony that we'll cover, only because New York is so different than the other colonies. New York is originally a Dutch colony, right? So it's established by the Netherlands, right? New York is actually originally called New Amsterdam, okay? I mean the city. The city is New Amsterdam, right? Because the colony is called New Netherlands. New York City is called New Amsterdam. Right? The Dutch are sort of significant in a couple of ways. One, yes, they set up a colony there in New York, but they're more French-esque or French-like in the sense that they want to trade for furs, right? They want to engage in commerce with the Native Americans. They are more concerned about that. Okay? So that's sort of first and foremost. Secondly, the Dutch, again, because they're Northern European, they have different ideologies or different understandings as it pertains to religion. Okay? In fact, the Dutch allowed Jews to settle in their colony, right? And the Jews at this time, do we know anything about Jewish history? Not much. The Jews are homeless, right? Like, the Jewish people do not have a place on the globe where they're like Israel is not created until after World War II. Hopefully you know that from like a world history class, right? Like, after World War II, as a result of the Holocaust, like, the people that won World War II were like, oh, we feel bad for the Jews, we're going to take these people's land and just give it to you, right? Prior to that point, the Jews have been a very nomadic people, right, that are traveling all over the place. The Dutch are more accepting of them, okay? So the Dutch allow them to move into New York. That's why you still have a fairly large Jewish community in New York City today. It goes all the way back to the 17th century. All right? So that's fairly significant for you. The couple of other things that I want you to understand about the Dutch and then about New York, right? Just like the English and the French are engaged in sort of a colonial battle, right? A global colonial conflict where they're trying to extend their authority all across the globe. The Dutch are the same way, right? Most of our European powers are engaged in some level of colonialism and globalism, right? The Portuguese have Brazil. The Spanish have South and Central America, right? France has Canada for a little bit, Great Lakes for a little bit. There's actually a territory at one point in time in world history called French Indochina, right, which is basically Vietnam, right? Vietnam was a French colony for a long time, okay? I mean, the Philippines was a Spanish colony for a long time. These are European powers. I mean, we could have a whole course on what Europe did to Africa, right? But it's basically an idea of trying to exert your dominance everywhere. The British and the British and the Dutch are going to get into some skirmishes and some conflicts over that as well. The Dutch are not nearly as successful colonially as the English are, right? I mean, ultimately, the English and the Spanish are probably the two biggest colonial powers during this time, right? The French are probably third. The Portuguese just got a raw deal from the Pope, right? Y'all know this in world history? So, we discovered the New World, right? Okay? Portugal and Spain are both Catholic countries. The Pope basically comes in and negotiates like a truce between the two of them. And they draw like an imaginary line, and they're like, okay, the Portuguese get everything on the east, and the Spanish get everything on the west. And the line, I kid you not, the line is drawn like right here, right? Because nobody knew what existed on this side of the line, right? Like for the Spanish, it's like a coin flip. They're like, I might get a lot, I might get a little, they don't know, right? But the Portuguese get like that, which is why the Portuguese really only controlled Brazil, right? And then the Spanish essentially get everything else, right? So the Dutch are going to lose out colonially relatively early on. They're still going to be significant, though, in the colonial aspect, because the Dutch are big slave traders. A lot of Dutch slave trading. Okay. All right, New Jersey. Again, this is another one of our middle colonies. We will talk about this, too. We're going to separate the colonies as we get into it next week. We're going to separate them regionally into sort of New England, the middle colonies, and then the southern colonies. And theoretically, you could do like New England, middle colonies, Chesapeake colonies, southern colonies. But Virginia and North Carolina are close enough to the same that I don't make that differentiation. right? So I'm going to use basically that map that you see right there on the side. Right, New England is that beigeish color. The middle colonies are that darker green. It's not a dark green. And then the southern colonies are that light green. So Jersey is established. Okay? Again, it's along the coast. It's looking at cultural and religious diversity. Okay? The middle colonies are religious, but they're not. I don't like using this term. They're not fanatical. Right? Do we understand what that means? No. So religious fanaticism is like fanatic. A fanatic is like historically, it's actually a negative term. Right? Like if you are a fanatic, that means you are crazily involved in something. Right? Like sports fanatics theoretically care way too much about their team, right? That's sort of what the term fanatic means, okay? Now, obviously, it's not the same today when we're like, oh, we're a fan. Fan comes from fanatic, right? So when we say religious, sort of fanatical religicisms or whatever, right? What we're really talking about is an extremely devout ideology in which non-conformists make a substantial difference. Okay. No, I would not say evangelicals are fanatical in that sense, because when you talk about fanaticism, it's more like evangelicals. Yeah, they'll proselytize, right? Which means they'll try to convert you. Like they'll talk to them blue in the face, trying to get you to believe what they believe. But they're not gonna like kick you out of town if you disagree. For the most part, at least the ones I know, right? They'll just judge you silently, right? I don't know if that's true. All right, but that's going to be stereotypical of your middle colonies as a whole, right? The middle colony that we'll talk about in the most detail will be Pennsylvania, right? New York is actually a middle colony. It wouldn't be a New England colony. We're going to call New York a middle colony. And so we will talk about New York, but as far as like the stereotyping and the culture and the religious aspects, we'll talk about Pennsylvania more. So Pennsylvania is established by a dude named William Penn. That's why it's Pennsylvania. Okay? William Penn is a Quaker. Okay? Quakers are a Protestant religion that is not in line with puritanical ideology, right? Quakers get their name, honestly, it's probably mildly, racist isn't the right word, that was the word I'm thinking of, derogatory, like it's not good, right? Let's go with derogatory. It's probably a derogatory term because the belief was that during their religious services they would like shake, like they would actually quake because of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, I mean you see how that's like you're kind of mocking those people then. Like it's not but they have different beliefs. They have a different set of understanding of sort of religion and Christianity. They don't have the same hierarchical structure of a lot of religions, right? Like a lot of religions, even Protestant religions, right? Like if you belong to a Protestant church, right? And I don't care if it's like Baptist or Methodist, whatever, right? Like your church probably has a senior pastor, right? Some sort of senior minister who is the head of the church, right? But then there's still a hierarchy that exists because churches have things called deacons. Does anybody know what that is? So like a deacon is just a member of the church that operates sort of as like a board of governors, right? Like to try to put it in terms that you might understand, think about like the school board, right? Like we have Dr. Nivens, who's the superintendent, right? Like as far as hierarchy goes, that would be your minister. Then we have the school board. Those would be like your deacons, right? Theoretically, if the deacons are unhappy with the minister, they can remove them, right? Like that's how a minister could lose his church. Okay? But there's still a very structured, rigid hierarchy to that. The Quakers have far less rigidity to them, right? So they have their meetings, right? And this is also part of the reason why they got that term, the Quakers. I mean, they would essentially sit around and wait for somebody to be moved by the Holy Spirit to really sort of do anything, right? It wasn't the same concept of somebody standing at some sort of lectern or pulpit, preaching at you, telling you to repent for your sins or whatever, right? Penn also founds Delaware, although Delaware is going to break off from Pennsylvania. So again, if you look, right, Delaware is providing a little bit more coastline for Pennsylvania, but it's going to end up becoming its own colony. And again, we're going to call Delaware middle colony, although Delaware there's some aspects of Southern culture to Delaware. Yes, ma'am.
You know how we have 50 states? Could we add a state if we wanted to?
Yes. There's a whole thing. You'll cover this in more detail next year in government, but the Constitution itself lists the outline for how to add states, right? In fact, part of the Republican platform right now is to make Puerto Rico a state. It's financial. If you live, okay, this is a government lesson that you don't need to know in this class. If you live in Puerto Rico, right? Well, one, you have a representative in the House of Representatives, but they're there for observatory purposes only, right? They can't speak. They certainly don't get to vote, right? But Puerto Ricans also don't pay taxes. So this is the really weird thing about Puerto Rico, right? Because there was actually a Supreme Court case that was decided a year ago. Puerto Rican dude moves to New York, lives in New York, works in New York for a very, very long time, right? So now, one, he was an American citizen of Puerto Rico. He's an American citizen in New York. It's not like his citizenship changed. It's not like his status as an American changed, right? But living in New York, he has to pay income tax and Social Security tax and everything like that, right? Then the dude retires, he starts pulling Social Security, he moves back to Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans don't get Social Security because they don't pay into it. The Supreme Court actually is now telling him he owes all of this money back to the government because he shouldn't have been getting benefits while living in Puerto Rico, which doesn't make much sense to me because he was paying into the system while living in New York. Yeah. But this is what makes Puerto Rico so complex, and then this is also part of the reason why when was it Maria? I don't remember what y'all know a hurricane hit Puerto Rico 2-3 years ago, and Puerto Rico was just done, right? No electricity or running water for weeks. It's partly because there's not the same systems in place because they're not a state, they're a territory, right? But then that gets really weird because there's a territory, is it American Samoa in the Pacific Islands, where you do get Social Security there because you pay federal taxes. It's really weird. I'll be honest with you, I don't understand why the U.S. still has territories. Honestly, Puerto Rico and honestly, Guam and American Samoa, and there's one more out there, isn't there? Maybe there's not. Whatever. Just take the two of them and make them one state. And as far as I'm concerned, you can take the U.S. Virgin Islands and lump it in with Puerto Rico and make it one state. I mean, Hawaii's a state, and Hawaii's 50 some odd different islands? Why can't we make Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands one state? They're not that close together, but, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Do we have to know, what, type of, what is it called, intramural colony or joint stock?
You need to understand the difference between
So
the
I don't
three.
need to know which one is which.
No, okay, so I want you to understand that Virginia is a joint stock company.
Okay.
I want you to understand that. I want you to understand that the earliest examples are joint stock companies, right? So Virginia and Massachusetts are joint stock companies initially because that's the easiest way to do it because that minimizes that provides the least risk to financial investors. But no, you're not going to get a question on the test that's was Delaware a proprietorship, royal colony, no, you're not going to get that question. That's rote memorization. That is not what my tests are about. My tests are about applying information, right? Okay, so like you should be able to apply. Virginia was established like the way that it was, right? In order to, like a joint stock company requires what? Joint stock companies are set up in order to accomplish what?
Stop.
What? It's a company. Y'all understand? Every company in the world, that's why a company exists, yes? To turn a profit. Well, stocks is just selling ownership in a company. That's really what a stock is. Alright? We're going to go to the Carolinas. Right, so North and South Carolina. So they're a proprietary colony, right? They've got 8 proprietors. Okay, so they're going to have exclusive ownership. Again, there's constitutions that are being written during the 17th century. Do we know what a constitution is? Like lowercase c constitution?
No.
Because we're in colonial America. Yeah, we're in a new unit. You took a test. That's why you can't find it. Okay. Okay. Do we know what a lowercase c constitution is?
No.
A constitution is simply a document outlining the sort of rules and regulations of government, right? It is a document that determines or dictates those behaviors that government is going to be involved in. All right? That's sort of the idea. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, the Fundamental Constitution of Carolina, these are written documents that are going to determine what can and cannot happen within the colony. Okay? And I want you to understand that this is coming. I don't talk about this a ton. I don't teach about this a ton because I'll be honest, I operate on the assumption that you learned this in world history, right? That you've learned about the Enlightenment. Yes?
No.
Okay? This comes out of Enlightenment ideologies, right? The Enlightenment is this new way of thinking in the 17th century, right? That like mankind has basic rights, like you are entitled to a right to life, like I can't just come kill you for the sake of killing you, right? You are entitled to freedom. I can't just like lock you up in a prison for no reason just because I'm bigger than you, right? Like that. There is a new way of thinking that is occurring in the 17th century, and it keeps showing up in colonial America because we're going to continue to do things that place limitations on institutions in order to protect individual sort of liberty and freedom and human rights and things like that. We begin to get concerned with that. This is also part of the reason why you see, I mean outside of the Puritans, a whole lot more religious tolerance, right, that's occurring, because it's really hard to operate in the Enlightenment and then be like a convert or die religious zealot, right? Because if you have freedom, right, I mean, if you are born with freedom to engage in whatever behaviors you want to on your own, so long as they don't infringe upon somebody else's freedoms, then if I want to put a colander on my head and worship the flying spaghetti monster, I can do that. That's a real religion. You'll learn about it next year. Y'all have never heard of Pastafarianism?
No.
Don't worry about it. Yeah, we'll talk about it next year.
Worship pasta.
Okay? Alright, so Virginia, by 1729, Virginia is going to become a royal colony. Right? 1719, South Carolina is going to become a royal colony. So, Abby, you were asking, this is the other thing that I want you to understand about all of these. By the end, what is everything?
Royal colony.
It's all a royal colony, right? And it's all a royal colony by the end because the joint stock companies are going out of business because they can't turn a profit, right? It's really hard to turn a profit. Okay, especially when you were operating, these people were all operating on the assumption, we're gonna find gold. Right? Like if you had found gold, everybody gets rich real fast. Right? If you don't find gold, now you're not generating the wealth that you thought. Right? South Carolina we'll talk about in a fair amount of detail as well, because South Carolina is fascinating throughout history, because South Carolina is, they're the first to secede, they're the first to do a whole bunch of things, right? They're also by far the biggest slave-based culture that we have in the United States, or what becomes the United States. Charleston, South Carolina, for instance, at one point in time, the population of Charleston, South Carolina is like 80% slave, right? Right, like almost, in fact, South Carolina on some level, if you learn this in world history and you learn about like Caribbean nations, South Carolina is way more like a Caribbean nation than it is like the rest of America. Okay, now that's also true because sugarcane grows in South Carolina, right, and it doesn't really grow anywhere else. And we'll get into this in like future units. We'll talk about sugar more. Because slaves that lived on sugar plantations, right, their average life expectancy was like 30. Right? The amount of labor necessary to take sugar cane and basically generate like molasses and sugar out of it is incredibly labor intensive. Right? And so the more labor intensive it was, right, obviously the harder you're working your slaves, therefore the faster they're going to die. Okay? If you are, obviously anybody who becomes a slave is very unlucky in life, right? But like, being on a sugar plantation was a significantly worse life for a slave than being sold into like Baltimore. Honestly, if you were a slave sold to Baltimore, for instance, you might have learned a trade like, how to be a carpenter. Right? And then if it's 1840 and you're a kid and you learn how to be a carpenter, like you actually have a real skill once slavery ends. Right? But also, even if it's like 1740, having a real skill as a slave provides you with at least a little bit more, because now like people are more dependent upon your job and your skill than they are like somebody just pressing sugarcane or picking cotton out of a plant, like the things that were happening in southern plantations, right? So again, a lot of the people that are coming to South Carolina are actually not coming directly from England, right? They were English planters that went to Barbados, which is a Caribbean island, and then they're coming up from there, right? That brings us a little further south to Georgia. Georgia's a fascinating colony because Georgia is created as a utopian, right? That's the idea. Georgia is supposed to be this utopian community, open to everybody, right? Like black, white, Jew, Christian, Muslim, like what? They don't care. Open to everybody, right? In fact, a lot of the people that are coming to Georgia are actually coming out of debtor's prison in England, right? So they're incapable of paying off debts in England. They're going to come to Georgia, and then it's twofold, right? So Georgia, one is a utopian society that's going to try to provide an opportunity for these poor people while benefiting England by getting rid of all of England's poor. But, right, if we go back and we look at our map, here's Georgia, there's Florida. Florida is controlled by Spain. Spain is the real threat to England in terms of global dominance at this point, right? So Georgia is also going to become a buffer to Spanish Florida and possible Spanish expansion into North America. This is the other reason why they take all these poor people, because everybody in Georgia is essentially like militia and front line against the Spanish. So you have to be willing to fight in that regard as well. But again, if you're living in a prison, right, if you're living in debtor's prison in England, the idea of fighting on the frontier, or not even fighting, but maybe just possibly having to fight, probably beats prison. Beat prison to me. I'm just saying, that's me. Right? New Hampshire originally starts as a part of Massachusetts as well. I don't care about New Hampshire. Like this This is just 13, so it's just in there, right? We'll eventually talk about New Hampshire when we talk about like the economy of New England, because it's relatively significant in that way. There's a lot of fishing and timber up there, and those are going to become two of the major industries for New England, right? That image right there is actually like a whole bunch of codfish. Right? Yeah. Fishing, like commercialized fishing, is big money, man. Like big money. Y'all ever see like the Discovery show Dangerous Catch?
Oh yeah.
Dude, like the people out there trying to catch like crab and lobster and whatnot up in like Arctic waters, you make a lot of money doing that, right? Now you can also make nothing because you're only making money based on what you catch, right? And it's rough. Like the seas out there are rough. Like the conditions are rough. It's not a great job, but that's going to be sort of New Hampshire's impact on all of this. Right, it's a very, very small colony. It's a very, very small community, right? They're going to create small towns, but we'll talk about that as well, right? Because as we get into the culture, right? And actually, now that I think about it, it might be on your quiz tonight. You could look it up. We'll definitely cover it before your next test. But y'all understand. In fact, I'm gonna go back. Where's New York? You see New York right there? New York is incredibly. Anybody here been to New York? Oh, a lot of you. Holy cow! Right. So if you were on the corner of like 3rd and Madison, right, and you're trying to get to the corner of like 10th and Madison, how far away are you? 7 blocks. Like, New York is the most logically laid out city in the world, right? In fact, New York is so logically laid out that, like, streets go this way and avenues go this way, or vice versa. I don't know which is which, right? But so if you're like at 117th and 54th, and you need to go to 101st and 52nd, right? It's like down 13, right 2. Like, it's that structure. So the New England area, they build towns like pretty much immediately, right? I don't remember it. The Deadly Discontented Winter, they talk about that, don't they? The reading? Don't they talk about building? Because they talk about setting up that town, right? And building homes for people in that chapter. I mean, they do in the book, right? So they find a cleared area already. They have like a communal gardening area, but they have like a community center in the middle, right? And then they build homes around that. And New England towns, like even in the 17th century, are like gridded community towns, right? Whereas what do we do in the South? Plantations. One dude owns like 10,000 acres. That's not a town. It's an agricultural factory, really. I mean, you want to talk about that. All right? And I think that can get you through the quiz tonight. Again, because I do things differently every year. I can't guarantee that every question. I don't want to make that guarantee. But here's the deal. Y'all understand at this point, if there's a question on the quiz and you don't see it on the PowerPoint, you have Google, right? You have your buddy, yes? Right? Like, I'm not going to lie. Like, I noticed one of you today while I was doing this, like, taking pictures of somebody else's notes. I don't know if you were absent or not. I'm totally okay with that. That is like, it's the only way you're going to survive in college. Okay? I mean, that's not true. You can survive in college doing everything all on your own. I don't need this on the recording.